So thank you very much. I appreciate you for inviting myself and my husband to Arizona. We enjoy it very much. We took a nice leisurely drive. We drove here from the Black Hills of South Dakota over the last 3 days, and it was very nice because it actually gave me a time to relax from running 2 different businesses and a teenager. And so it's been very sweet to have a relaxing time period down here. I want to ask a few beginning basic questions. I want to see what your background is so that I can then orientate myself to address everybody here. So I'm taking that most of you are either practicing astrologers or have been studying for a while. Do I have anybody who's real new to astrology? So I've got a couple of people. Okay, all right. I teach astrology a lot, and the method that I practice is evolutionary astrology. It's a very spiritually based astrology, and one of the things that I want to do in the next hour is give you a little bit of background about evolutionary astrology and our method of chart interpretation. How many of you are familiar with the Jeffrey Wolf Green method of evolutionary astrology? So a few of you, but there's several of you who are not familiar with this method, correct? Okay. Evolutionary astrology is a term that was first used by Ray Merriman about 40 years ago. And about 35 years ago, an astrologer named Jeffrey Wolf Green developed this method that we use, and he received it through dreams. The term is becoming more and more popularized as being an umbrella term for spiritual astrology. The Jeffrey Wolf Green method, which I found in 1985, is a very specific method for looking at the soul and its ego as it incarnates itself lifetime after lifetime. So evolutionary astrology, or EA as we call it, is very reincarnationally based. The method that Jeffrey developed basically utilizes the planet Pluto as being representative of the soul. So in your chart, by sign, Pluto takes 248 years to go around the zodiac. It's a very elliptical passage. It spends anywhere from 10 years to 30 years in the 12 signs of the zodiac. Ironically, Scorpio, which Pluto's the modern ruler of, is only 10 years in that sign, whereas the opposite sign, Taurus, Pluto takes 32 years to go through that sign of the zodiac. Right now, Pluto in Capricorn, it's a 15-year transit. Wherever Pluto resides in your chart by sign represents the generation of souls that you were born into. For instance, Pluto in Cancer generation. These are souls who came in from 1938-39 through 1956-57. Pluto in Cancer with teens up until 1938-39. Pluto in Cancer generation is a very traditional generation, especially with its early conditioning. In other words, we would joke it was the Betty Crocker Marble Man generation. When World War II came along, all of a sudden the men left and the women had to go out of the kitchen, and they had to learn how to have jobs. They had to learn how to get out of the household. In other words, they had to learn how to go to the polarity of Cancer and take responsibility for their own life, Capricorn. In evolutionary astrology, the opposite sign of the generation you were born into represents your soul's evolutionary intent in this life by generation. So the Pluto in Cancers had to come from the traditional gender assignments. They had to come from being in the home environment and move out into the world and learn some of the deeper psychology of Capricorn, which is self-determination and self-responsibility. That creates career. For instance, again, another example for many of you is the Pluto in Leo generation. This is a generation of souls who are very creatively based. They have spent most recent past lives trying to discover what was unique and special about them and what was that creativity they were going to bring onto the planet that would just allow them to bloom and blossom and be noticed. Leo. The lesson for Pluto and Leos is Aquarius, objectivity. Leo is a very subjective sign. The universe revolves around me. Aquarius is the group, society, the tribe, the larger picture. So that objectivity of what does the group need. So the Pluto and Leo generation had to learn what does the group need first and how do my talents fit into a societal need. When they're able to recognize that polarity point, then all of a sudden their creativity flourishes, doors open. So all of the Pluto generations will come in with this undercurrent or flavoring. Where Pluto exists in your chart by natal house is your soul's own individual karma and polarity point, dharma. Let me back up one moment. We are going to speak about the cycle of phases and aspects. I'll give brief comments on that tonight. We'll go into it in more depth tomorrow. Two of the things that's very foundational to evolutionary astrology is what I'm speaking about right now. The soul and its ego. Pluto and the nodes of the moon. And we have a specific formula for looking at that, which we are in process of going over very uniquely. But any of you who have been practicing astrologers or studying astrology for a while, by the time you start looking at a planet in a house and a sign and you start looking at the aspects, it's so easy for it to just go way over your head. And one of the things that's really been coming out over the last 20, 30 years is the more psychological or humanistic sides of astrology. And one of the missing pieces for always being able to put chart interpretation together is what we call this cycle of phases and aspects. And this is what we're going to focus upon so you can take all these different planetary objects and learn how to synergize them together, learn how they work together. If you look at natural law, if you look out at nature, everything is in a relationship to everything else, whether we recognize it or not. The same thing is true with every planetary object in your chart. Every object is in a relationship to every other object. And there's always a process that is cyclical in regards to these relationships. And that birth chart, that snapshot of you, describes all of these different parts of your soul and your ego and your personality that is in relationship to everything else within you. And so when I discovered astrology, I was lucky in that I discovered the cycle of phases and aspects pretty early on. It was originally written about by Dane Rudier, The Lunation Cycle, if any of you remember that book. And then the Geoffrey Wolf Green method of evolutionary astrology picked it up and just went further with it. There is one handout when we're on the break that you are all welcome to take a copy of, Cycle of Phases and Aspects. And if you do take it and you're coming back tomorrow, bring it with you. I'll have some more for tomorrow, but just in case, I'd like to have enough handouts for that. So sorry, thank you for letting me do that little side trip. Back to some of our basic principles of the soul and its ego, or the methodology that evolutionary astrology uses. When we start looking at Pluto by natal house, I have Pluto in the 8th house. So I say I am a Scorpio, 8th house, soul, Pluto. I'm a Scorpio soul. I married a Gemini soul who has natal Pluto in his 3rd house. He's Pluto in Leo generation, I'm Pluto in Virgo generation. So this is how we start to speak the language for that. And giving you an example, somebody who is Pluto in Leo generation, where is my creativity? Who's going to notice me? look at what I'm doing with my life. And he's behind the camera, a Leo, Pluto and Leo behind the camera. His third house, natal Pluto, is dealing with all of this technology. The Gemini soul that can run the diversity of this piece of equipment and that piece of equipment and this detail and that detail and all this stuff. That's how that generation's creativity is coming out. So that natal Pluto by individual house is very unique to each of us as individuals. It describes where our own individual soul is coming from by way of most recent past lives. That opposite house of our natal Pluto is going to describe where the soul is intending to evolve in this lifetime on an individual level. This Pluto in Leo, behind the camera, belongs to the polarity point generation of Aquarius, traditional ruler of astrology. His polarity point as an individual soul is the 9th house. He's recording spiritual astrology. So that's just a very simplified example for it, but this is the starting point for all of us in evolutionary astrology. And that right there can give you a wealth of information on any individual. I tell my students, if you can't talk for an hour on natal Pluto by sign and house and the polarity point by sign and house, you need to go back and learn a few more of the basic archetypes. Because, as you know, astrology is very archetypically based. Something else that we look at that is germane to evolutionary astrology, you know this. When you look at a chart, it doesn't tell you the gender. You don't know whether it's male or female. The chart also does not tell you the state of consciousness for that soul. It's a term we use called evolutionary states. Basically, very quickly, the 3 major states are consensus. Approximately 7 out of 10 people walking around on the planet are in what we call consensus. If somebody says astrology is the work of the devil, they take it in wholeheartedly. If somebody says you need to be a Republican or a Methodist or whatever, they take in all the environmental conditioning. They don't question it. Eventually, after lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes, souls will evolve or expand in consciousness, larger and larger points of reference, into what we will call the individuated state. This is approximately 2 out of 10 souls running around on the planet, and it's exactly what the word means, individualizing. Wait a minute, I'm going to think for myself. I'm going to choose my beliefs. I'm going to rebel against the beliefs that I don't agree with. I'm going to search for what I feel is right for me as an individual. Many times your more formalized religions belong in consensus. Individuating will still have religion. It'll have atheism. It will have New Age spirituality. It will have all different kinds of belief systems that the soul is going back and forth with, trying to discern where they naturally reside and what fits for them. And then eventually you will have souls that will move into what we will call the spirituated state. Approximately 1 out of 10 souls on the planet right now. Any race, any country, whatever their environmental conditionings are. Spirituated are the souls that are really trying to look at universal or timeless spiritual principles that have always existed regardless of the overlays of human-made conditionings. In evolutionary astrology, when we look at a chart, that chart doesn't tell us gender, nor will it tell us where the consciousness of that soul is. The example that I like to give with the different evolutionary states, I like to use Taurus. If we look at the archetype of Taurus in the 2nd house and we're consensus, where's my BMW? Where is my portfolio? Where's my creature comforts in my house? Now, we'll have that when we're spirituated, but it doesn't have to be the guiding system we go by. The consensus state of souls have a tendency to be more ego-based, driven by the third chakra. The individuated state is still egoically based, but there's an opening up to these deeper messages of the soul. So when you start to have Taurus in the individuated state, sometimes there's not the material goods, so that it leads them to question that why. Why don't I have money? The individualized state of consciousness is trying to recognize that they are more than their pocketbook. The spirituated state is where there is the shift in the soul from being ego-based to being soul-based. They're really trying to open up all chakras, but trying to move up to the higher chakras, but have all of them included. Spirituated state Taurus will recognize the ultimate resource on the planet, which is source energy itself, whatever you want, a language you want to call it. God, Goddess, Great Spirit, whatever you want to use. So you can take any of the 12 archetypes of the zodiac, and all 12 archetypes expand in consciousness. This is something that must be done through observing and correlating, observing and correlating. I like to tell students of astrology, go to the grocery store, go to the post office, go to some place, some public place where you will have all types of people interacting, and just observe through conversations. And you can start to then learn how to pick up these different states of consciousness, or how the soul is expanding in its awareness. This makes sense for people? Questions? Anytime you have questions, you're welcome to interrupt me and ask. I don't mind at all. I'll keep my flow going. But this is just some little snapshots that I'm wanting to give you for some background information on evolutionary astrology. Okay. So we all know that Pluto is representative of a soul. For most of us, even when we're individualizing and spiritualizing, that soul operates on a fairly unconscious level. Just look at the planets Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and how when you start to study astrology, there can sometimes be a little questioning of what that archetype really means. What do those planets really mean? And they can grasp so much in that whole archetype. So the soul, every time it incarnates, comes through an ego. For those of you who feel that Jesus was a human being who walked the planet, he developed an ego. He was a Pisces. He was known for a sense of humor. Pisces is known for its humor. The ego, you guys are going to know this from the more traditional forms of astrology, the ego is always represented by the nodes of the moon. We know the moon itself, as it moves around the planet Earth, moving around our geocentric zodiac once a month. Moon makes every single possible aspect it can make to every other planet in 1 month. So when you look at how the moon is representative of the emotional body, look at all the emotions we go through in a month, let alone a day, let alone an hour. So we know that moon is the emotional body, which is that self-image that reflects ourself back to ourself. How we feel about ourselves on any moment, emotionally. When we look at the nodes of the moon, the south node, the point in space where the moon's path crosses the sun's path, the ecliptic, that south node is always representative of the ego that the soul developed in past lives in order to feel secure. So Pluto by natal sign and house is where the soul's coming from. And that south node by sign house, and you can add aspects onto this, is the ego the soul developed in order to be more conscious of itself, in order to know itself. That's why so much past life astrology will associate with the south node of the moon, because we all know that ego. Think of your own south node. You all know it. It's comfortable. It's where you're coming from. The north node of the moon is the ego we are striving to evolve into this lifetime. It is the ego that the soul is creating as the soul itself is learning to evolve. We can all recognize that north node because, again, it's egoically based, it's very conscious. But it's much easier to go to that south node. It takes effort to move into our north node, yet we can be conscious of it. Now, there are little variations to this formula, okay? We don't have time to go into them. Jeffrey's original book, Pluto, The Evolutionary Journey of the Soul, Volume 1, it's been reprinted. You can go there. After the break, I'll talk about our website and some of our resources that we have that you can go visit for more information if you'd like to. But this is just a little brief overview for you of the soul and its ego. All right, make sense? Questions? Anybody? What I'd like to discuss next, and probably discuss for as much time as we have left this evening, is a concept we call planetary pairs. For many of you, you know these planetary pairs, the sun and the moon, Mercury, Uranus, Venus and Neptune, Mars and Pluto. There's every single planet will make a planetary pair with every other planet. Yet as we've been going through and working with astrology, we start to associate certain planets as planetary pairs. You know, they're buddies, they get along, or they represent archetypes in consciousness that are so interrelated. They just naturally seem to be a planetary pair, even if they don't seem to be bosom buddies. So I'd like to just go through some of these planetary pairs for you. And then what we'll do tomorrow, when we learn the cycle of phases and aspects and how we actually work with that in a chart, then we'll use some of these planetary pairs as specific examples. And one of the things that I'd like to do tomorrow is, rather than me come up with a list of charts that I can show you, I'm going to have a clipboard at the break, this little red clipboard. And if you would like me to use your chart as example tomorrow, come over here and give me your name and put your birth data down. And put the house system you prefer. My default's potpourri. If you don't mention a house system, I'll use any house system. But if you'd like to use your own charts as example, I'll take this home, I'll draw up the charts, and tomorrow afternoon we will use your charts with these planetary pairs, so that it can be real for all of you, and you can see these examples in action, because your acquaintances, you'll recognize certain things from each other. So when we look at the concept of planetary pairs, we'll see where I can get, and if we can move through most of them tonight. For instance, the sun and the moon. In evolutionary astrology, the sun is the creative self-actualization. Traditional astrology will call it like your personality, your life force. Think about it. For all of us, the sun, ruler of Leo, 5th house, who of us do not know our own sun sign or our house sign, or our own sun sign or sun house, and expressing that as an identity that we're solar, consciously aware of within ourselves? I have a 9th house sun. I stand up and speak, blah, 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 blah. I have sun in Scorpio. I go right to the chase. I don't fluff around with language all the time. Get to the point. Tell me what you want. So that sun is that creative self-actualization. We already spoke about the moon being that self-image that reflects back to us moment by moment. When we put the sun and the moon together, it's the solar lunar, but this is the essence of our consciousness. This is the part of ourself that is trying to express ourselves in the world based upon the degree of emotional self-reliance we've developed. The moon, that emotional self-image, It's also that emotional body, and what are we trying to do on an emotional level? We're always trying to evolve to a new level of emotional security or emotional self-reliance. So that planetary pair of the sun and the moon, in its relationship in your chart, is going to describe how you are trying to express yourself based upon your level of emotional self-reliance and security. Another tidbit for you on the cycle of phases and aspects. When we say that every planetary object is in a relationship to every other planetary object, it is phase first, aspect second. The aspect comes from the phase. And there are the 8 phases. Let me see if I can bring this up on the board for you, or up on the screen for you right away. And I'll keep speaking while I'm working to do this. Again, this is the handout that I have for you at the break. All right? So you want to take this and you want to make sure you bring it back tomorrow if you're coming. Many of you might be familiar with the 8 phases. It takes a 360-degree circle, divides it by 45. New, crescent, first quarter, gibbous, full, disseminating, last quarter, balsamic. And you'll see around the outer circle is all of the aspects, major and minor. And we go out to the 8th harmonic with these, well, 12th harmonic if you use the 30 degrees. And so when I say that every planet is in a relationship to every other planet, it is the phasal relationship that is the foundation that the specific aspect then expresses from. That right there takes a ton of confusion out of aspects. Because when you can recognize, for instance, in our world, when we are looking at, let me find my little lighter right here. Many of you are familiar with squares. When we're looking at squares in evolutionary astrology, this right here, first quarter, is it a crescent phase square, meaning it's 80 to 90 degrees, or is it a first quarter square, meaning it's 90 to 100 degrees? Up here, last quarter square, is it disseminating 260 to 270, or is it from 270 to 280? There are 4 different squares in a chart, 4 possible different squares. So when you can learn that phasal relationship of the type of square between any 2 planets, again, you can see that all of a sudden there's a lot more information. There's a lot of difference between a crescent square where there's a struggle and it's yin energy, versus a last quarter square, and it's all about old beliefs that need to be released, and it's yang. There's a lot of difference between those 2 types of squares. That's what we'll go over tomorrow with these planetary pairs and with different examples in the charts. And I'll also explain, tomorrow's going to be the math, I'll also explain how to learn to determine, whoops, I'll get out of the way here, how to determine these different types of relationships between any 2 planets. So moving along then, I'm starting with the sun. If we then move on from the moon, and again, we've determined this inner security, this self-image, this emotional self-reliance. Another planetary pair that we're all very familiar with is the moon and Saturn. Mom and Dad. In evolutionary astrology, we look at the moon, Cancer, 4th house as the nurturing parent, which in this evolving world may or may not be the mother. We look at Saturn, Capricorn in the 10th house as the more authoritarian planet. Parent. Thank you. I have Sun, Mercury, Neptune between 1 and 2 degrees Scorpio. So Leroy, my husband, always has permission to correct me when I get going, and Mercury and Neptune start doing their little things together. So anyway, Saturn may or may not be the father, but it will always be the more authoritarian parent in the family dynamics. Another tidbit with evolutionary astrology, we do not look at a differentiation between the house and the sign. We're looking at archetypes in consciousness, the Jungian type. And so we will, when we are teaching the basics of evolutionary astrology and we say, go learn the 12 archetypes, Saturn, Capricorn, and the 10th house are very similar archetypes in consciousness. And so we sometimes have a tendency to want to make astrology more complicated than it has to be. So when we look at this Moon-Saturn planetary pair, we are looking at the fusion of the early nurturing environment and how that is then developed out into the world. It is the process of growing up. It is the process of going out of the womb and into the world. Cancer, Capricorn. So how well we do out in the world, Saturn, will be reflected from how well we were nurtured in our early home environment. So the Moon and Saturn are always going back and forth between inner and outer security, that inner emotional world, and how well we feel sustained and supported, and how we then are productive in the outer world. Career, how we take responsibility for our life, even if we've done nothing but stay home and raise the kids all our life. So the Moon-Saturn planetary pair, again, is always that developmental relationship from the early environment to how it is then taken out into the world. Moving on, Mercury. Mercury has a couple of planetary pairs. First of all, Mercury and Jupiter. Evolutionary astrology, Mercury has a dual rulership right now. Its outer side Gemini, its inner side Virgo. And that's just by the yin and yang, the polarities of the 12 archetypes. Mercury and Jupiter have a relationship in that Mercury is representative of the left brain, Jupiter is representative of the right brain. So Mercury and Jupiter are always describing how the mind is working on a conscious level between what it does left brain, classifying, analyzing, labeling, connecting dots together. If I have one more class, I'll figure astrology out. Versus Jupiter, right brain, the intuitive part of ourself that senses and knows we know something without always knowing how we know it. And there's an interface that goes back and forth all the time between Jupiter and Mercury, between the left brain, right brain, between analyzing and intuiting. Now, the faster moving planet always has to surrender to the slower moving planet. So left brain is going to have to always, at some point, what will happen with Mercury and its rulership of both Gemini and Virgo is we just get overly saturated with information. That's why we have Mercury retrogrades, Mercury direct. But that oversaturation of the left brain then just involutes on itself or throws their hands up in the air and they have to go take a walk, nature, Jupiter, Sag, and all of a sudden, poof, intuition brings it in. And Mercury goes, that's it. That's the relationship between Mercury and Jupiter. That's their planetary pair together. Is this making sense? Is this working for everybody with this? With that? Let me give you a tidbit here. So if Mercury is between 0 and 180 degrees with Jupiter, Mercury is moving away from Jupiter, and that left brain is trying to lead the show. It's trying to go out there and search for all the details, search for the facts, search for the information. If Mercury is between 180 degrees and 360 degrees to Jupiter, Mercury's coming back to Jupiter, and the left brain is having to surrender to right brain, and it's a little bit easier. Yeah. Okay. Take a circle, 360, divide it by 2. The first half is waxing, second half is waning. Okay? When the faster moving planet is waxing to the slower moving planet, breaking free, leading the way, it thinks it's in charge. When the faster moving planet is in the second half of the circle to the slower moving planet, the surrender comes back. The slower moving planet goes, come here. You know, and with Mercury, Jupiter, it's the right brain going, you can go take all the classes you want, but if you don't bring me to the party, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay? Mercury also has a relationship with Uranus. They're a real familiar planetary pair, too. Now, the 3 outer planets in evolutionary astrology are very psychologically based. Evolutionary astrology looks at Uranus as the individuated unconsciousness. Repeat, individuated unconsciousness. 3 types of information contained in Uranus. Past in all its detail of this and every life you've ever lived and everything you've experienced in this lifetime. Where does it go when Mercury forgets it? It goes down to the Uranus in the individuated unconsciousness. That's what you access with hypnotherapy and past life regression. Uranus also contains everything we suppress in the consciousness. Saturn, I'll get to Saturn and Uranus. I'll talk about that as a planetary pair. Everything Saturn doesn't want to deal with, it dumps down below the consciousness, dumps down to Uranus. Uranus always dumps it back up to Saturn. Saturn is the individuated consciousness in EA. Saturn, individuated consciousness. Uranus, individuated unconsciousness. There's their planetary pair. Uranus also contains the blueprints of the future. Traditional astrology talks about the lightning bolt, the flashes of insight that are Uranus. That is those future-orientated messages that the soul, on an unconscious level, pops up through Uranus in this very disjointed Uranian way. So Uranus contains the past, what we suppressed in the present, and the blueprints of the future in the individuated unconsciousness. That's the archetype of Uranus. So when you put Mercury and Uranus together as a planetary pair, we have the conscious mind, the unconscious mind. Conscious mind, Mercury, unconscious mind, Uranus. Health and wellness astrology, which is also something else that I teach in EA. Uranus rules the brain. And Uranus and Mercury rule the synapsal structure of the brain. And when we learn new information and the brain has to create a dendrite to hold that information, it's co-ruled by Mercury, Uranus. The conscious mind, the unconscious mind. And so when Uranus is trying to think and remember somebody's name, it's asking Uranus. And Uranus will bring it up, most of the time. But that planetary pair between those two, it becomes very mental. It's all working with the brain, but it's working with it consciously or unconsciously. Okay? Venus and Mars. Timekeeper for myself here. Venus is, of course, as we know, giving and receiving love. But Venus also has the rulership of 2 signs of the zodiac. I'm going to move over here because I want to get out of that light for a minute. Venus also has 2 rulerships. The Taurus side is the inner side of Venus, which is self-reliance. I can take care of all my own needs. Venus's rulership of Libra is the outer side of Venus. It's where we want to have a relationship outside of ourselves with another. So Venus Taurus is an inner relationship with self first. And we don't, how do we merge with another Scorpio polarity if we don't have not learned how to merge with ourself first? And then the Libra side of Venus is where we take that relationship outside of ourselves. And one of the many things you find about Libra psychologically is projection and expectation. Anybody ever project onto relationships? Anybody ever expect something from a relationship? That's Libra. That's the Libra side of Venus. And so Venus then has a very interesting planetary pair with Mars. We all know that one. General society knows the symbols for Venus and Mars. Mars in evolutionary astrology is the conscious desire nature of the soul. Think about Mars, Aries, first house. If we didn't have a Mars in our chart, how would we get out of bed? Mars is always that instinctive action to become and to act upon the desires within the soul that exist so unconsciously. Pluto, I didn't say this in the beginning, I'll add this on for you. The soul itself is a dual desire nature. All of us have a dual desire within our soul. We have a desire to separate from that which created us. We left, the wave left the sea. The wave's rising up from the sea, and we're the wave, and we exist. I'm here. And so we have these desires that come forth. A new job, a new lover, a new car, a new house, a new dress, a new pair of golf clubs, a set of golf clubs, this blah, 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 blah. And so we call these the separating desires of the soul. And we have the desire, we achieve the desire, we have a momentary sense of satisfaction, and then we're left with, well, that's gone. Now I need another dress, or I need another purse, or I need another lover. Eventually, the soul starts to ask, is this all there is? What else is there? The other desire is the desire to know that from which we have come. The returning desire nature. Separating and returning is the dual desire nature of the soul. Eventually, souls exhaust those separating desires. That's how they move from consensus to individuating to spirituating, expanding. And as they're expanding and as they've exhausted that separating desire, then that desire to know, where did I come from? Why am I here? To spiritualize becomes stronger and stronger. Eventually, it becomes what we call the Buddha, the Avatar, the Yogananda. And so, because that dual desire nature is unconscious for most of us, like the soul itself is unconscious, the soul brings up it brings up the desire nature from Pluto to Mars. Mars is always instinctively acting upon the desires of the soul. There's the Mars-Pluto planetary pair. So there's a deeper, broader energy to the archetype of Mars that I wanted to explain to you. So back to Venus-Mars. This is how we desire to sustain ourselves and fulfill ourselves through another. Venus is our needs, Mars is desires. And all of us will have, let me back it up and go back a little bit further. Every single human being comes up through various conditionings. Familial, societal, religious, environmental, national. As we come up through those environmental conditionings, those conditionings create the values and belief systems we have. Beliefs are conditioned thoughts. Those beliefs and values that we create then determine what we think we need. And Venus relates to values. And Venus relates to the needs that come from our values. And then if we determine we need a new dress or we need a new job, then Mars becomes the instinctive desire to go act upon it. So Venus and Mars is that merging of being able to recognize our needs and desires, perceiving what we want and how we're going to go out and get it. Venus, Mars. All right? Make sense? All right, break at 10 to 8. All right, 10-minute break, and I'll come back and see where we get with the rest of the planetary pairs.